Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. My name is Zachary Mallory, and I am the founder and the host of the Rise Above Justice Movement and the Rise Above Justice Movement, the podcast. Today, I'll give a viewer discretion is advised due to the nature of the topics that we will be discussing. All right, so I am excited about this interview, and we're interviewing Katie Paul with the Tech Transparency Project. And I say we because today I am joined by my co founder and an all around badass, Gwen. Welcome to the podcast.
So happy to be here as always.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Gwen, it has been a while. Um, you've been working on some music, which we'll do a follow-up interview with you momentarily, probably pretty soon. I think we already have it scheduled, but deeply excited to sit down and learn about what you've been up to. But feel free to introduce yourself for everybody who may be listening right now, and then we'll bring Katie in just a moment.
Hello, everybody. I'm so happy to be back on the Rise Above Justice Movement podcast. I'm Gwen Levy. I am a musician, an activist, and I am a co-founder of Rise Above Justice Movement. And we have been doing this since, we've been with Rise Above Justice Movement since, I guess, September 2024 for me. And just honored, as always, to be here. And I'm so excited for the guest we have today. If Zachary, you'd like to introduce her.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Katie, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to sit down and talk with you today about some very serious topics because obviously, open AI and then deep fakes and a number of other things and how it kind of ties into survivor spaces. Gwen will be leading the conversation today. But to anybody out there, Katie, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here and discuss with you how we're all drowning in digital technology at the moment.
Yeah, I think it's very relevant to talk about this right now. And with the harm of AI and how it continues to advance, which I know we'll talk about here in just a bit. Um, but I would love for you to just kind of like walk us through a little bit about your background and what led you, to doing the work that you're doing now, and just give us a backstory on who Katie is and why this work matters directly to you.
Yeah, so if you look at my background, it does not look like somebody that would ever work for an organization related to technology. My background is in anthropology and archaeology, and my whole goal was initially I was going to be an archaeologist and go dig at a site forever and get my PhD, and that would be that. That'd be my childhood dream. But after I finished my master's degree, the Arab Spring happened, which is for anybody who followed it knows that was largely spurred by this positive movement of social media. Social media changing the world and giving people a voice. And at the same time, all of the things that I wanted to study and work on were being looted and trafficked across the Middle East. And in doing research on that, I stumbled upon these black market groups on Facebook that were massive for trafficking conflict antiquities from countries like Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, which is a war crime. And the first thing I thought was, oh my gosh, how the heck is this legal? This is a war crime. And this major American company is facilitating it. And that's what led me down the road of tech policy, really trying to understand how something that was so obviously illegal was so prominently featured. And in Communications Decency Act, Section 230, the 26 words that invented the internet, is what is the reason for that. And so many of the harms that we see unchecked in tech today. And that law, for those who aren't aware of it, is basically that any tech platform is free from legal and civil liability by content of any content posted by third parties. And that law turns 30 years old this year. It was from 1996, and technology has changed a lot since 1996. The initial reason for that law was so that, it wouldn't stifle American innovation. If a small company like eBay were to be responsible for somebody hosting horrible things on their platform, they're not a publisher, they're just simply the host. And so this law was written to keep keep these tech companies going. But now these aren't small, mom and pop in your garage tech companies. These are some of the most powerful corporations on the planet. And this isn't just a place where things are hosted. They algorithmically amplify, they heavily profit from it. And they're doing it all without really any regulation. And I quickly learned that the same mechanisms that were driving the trafficking I was seeing drive all manner of the harmful things we see on tech platforms, from human trafficking to endangered species trafficking to drug trafficking. And it's getting worse every year that we don't see our politicians step up and try to do something to rein in these harms.
And I think that really goes to show the culture we're in as well. I have questions for you about the lack of regulation, especially when it comes to AI and all the harm and damage we're seeing because of that. And I want to go back to when AI first came onto the scene, when we first started hearing about it. What were some of your immediate reactions, especially when it came to the lack of regulation we've seen, and specifically in the United States?
Well, I mean, I think we want to be specific about the kind of AI we're talking about and what we're talking about here, right? There's lots of different types of AI. Not all of it's bad.
Absolutely.
Yeah, the AI we're talking about here is more generative AI. People remember the really crappy video of Will Smith eating spaghetti that was generated, and people initially
Yes.
thought, oh, well, this isn't, that big. Obviously, it's advanced significantly since then. But at the time, at least my thought, because I was already working on issues around tech harms, was we haven't solved the issue of these social media platforms yet, and now they're starting to create their own stuff. How does that jive with Section 230? Because they are publishing content, and we haven't seen the courts have the opportunity to tackle that yet because it's moving so quickly. And when you look at even Congress attempting to catch up with big tech companies, the first time they held a major hearing with tech companies was in 2018. Some people may remember that hearing with Zuckerberg where they said, "How does your platform make money?" And he said, "Senator, we run ads." At that same hearing, you have older senators asking the CEO of Google why their iPhone doesn't work, and it was kind of a moment where it was clear that Congress hadn't fully caught up with or understood the technology that the majority of Americans were dealing with. And they're just now catching up to that, but we're already seeing these companies light years ahead of them. And it's really concerning because these companies have massive market power, massive influence in lobbying, in the administration, at the federal level, at the state level. And we're all just suffering the consequences of what that means. And that's something that, unfortunately, we're seeing the technology advance much faster than the laws can catch up.
So going off that, Katie, can you uh, tell us what the Tech Transparency Project is and how it came about and what you all are doing to address these issues, especially the harm that's coming from unregulated generative AI?
Yeah, so the Tech Transparency Project started several years before I was part of it as the Google Transparency Project, looking at this massive company that had a big role in everybody's, daily lives. And in 2020, we started expanding that research to other major tech platforms, turned it into the Tech Transparency Project. And the whole goal is to demystify technology that we all have to rely on, or in many cases, cannot separate ourselves from. So we want to give the public a seat at the table when it comes to big tech. It often gets compared when it comes to influence and lobbying to big tobacco, the big tobacco playbook. But something I try to remind people is that you don't have to smoke cigarettes. People have to use technology. We're using technology right now. You have to use it to communicate with your family, to pay your bills, to access your medical information. We can't unpair ourselves from this, nor can members of Congress who have to use it every day. So it's really a false comparison to big tobacco because this is not something that's elective. This is critical infrastructure for every American and most people around the world. And so it's an even more we're at an even more pivotal moment where people need to really understand the role of these massive companies, many of which are trusted brands, like the ones we'll discuss today. And at the same time, is that trust warranted? And I think that time and again, we're seeing that it's not, and that these companies are not able to regulate themselves. So, at Tech Transparency Project, we look at a number of things when it comes to different types of harms from platforms, harms to kids. And in those types of investigations, we'll use the platform exactly like anybody would use it. We don't try to do anything, super advanced. We're not hacking anything. We're using the platforms the way people use them and exposing where there is harm. We also look at the influence of these big tech companies, not just on Congress, but on members of different administrations over the years, how they're, engaging with different administrations, the ways that they're trying to line their own pockets. And other things that the tech companies do that are really harmful to society, to the United States, and just doing it in a way that we're not loading up the tech jargon. We're writing it so that someone like my mom and dad can understand what I'm talking about, even though they don't use a lot of the social media platforms we write about. And that's one of the primary goals of what we're doing. And I think it's important for you guys and platforms like the Rise Above Justice movement to raise this for the people who aren't going to sit down and read a long report about this. People want to be able to just digest it quickly and hear it. And I think getting that to everybody else, the having awareness around these issues, and especially around generative AI and the harms there, when it's moving so quickly, is something that is really important for all of us in this moment.
So, Katie, since generative AI is moving so quickly and it is not regulated in our country, and I've heard from people in Canada and other countries in Europe, etc., where they do have regulations revolving around AI. What would you and TTP like to see when it comes to regulation, when it comes to this generative AI?
I think when it comes to regulation, broadly, we just need to see our, American lawmakers step up and do something to keep up with the technology that we're seeing. Europe, as you mentioned, has really been the leader in regulation, which is unfortunate because the United States for so long was leading the way in addressing different types of harms. And now it's Europe. And with the Digital Services Act, which is a little over 2 years old now, it's really the first attempt at meaningful regulation. And one of the ways that they were able to do that is because the European market as a whole is significant for tech companies. They can't just pull out of Europe. They could threaten to pull out of one country or another, but they can't threaten to pull out of the entire European Union. And we know that these regulations can be impactful because you see the way that tech companies and CEOs are reacting to the mere threat of regulation from Europe. They have influence over the administration, who is threatening tariffs against the European Union for simply implementing the digital services agreement because they're claiming it would stifle American innovation. The same argument that was used to get those blanket liability, freedom from liability regulations under Section 230 30 years ago is being recycled now to try to, threaten Europe into revoking some or not applying some of their DSA regulations. And there can be big impact from those. Just like we all have to click accept cookies and understand what's on, our screens when we go to any website. That's because of a European regulation, GDPR, several years ago that was implemented, and companies and websites just implemented it across the board globally. What we haven't seen is US lawmakers stepping up. And what's really concerning is that these are American companies, and we're not seeing lawmakers step up to address them. There's lots of bills proposed every year. We have yet to see any of them pass.
That is very concerning. And I actually did not know that we have bills that have been presented that haven't passed. But it's unfortunately, right, it's not surprising, especially since we've seen who really is in the pockets of our politicians and who's running the country. We saw it at the inauguration, speaking specifically about Donald Trump's second inauguration. I do want to ask you though, because I think for someone like myself and our listeners, what are cookies? Because I actually don't know myself. I'd love for you to explain that if you're able to answer.
Yeah, I mean, it's when you are online basically and you're being tracked. So you visited a clothing website like Nordstrom or something, and then all of a sudden every other website you go to read an article has all these ads for Nordstrom. It's how you're being followed across the internet based on your online history. And, accepting that when you click accept, you're basically accepting that different types of activity are going to be tracked by that website, which is pretty common. And it's basically making you aware that that happened. What GDPR did was making it so that it had to be disclosed that you were going to be tracked online. And that's why all of your ads seem incredibly relevant because they are. They're following you on the internet. And that's something that is been going on for a long time, but the GDPR really brought it to the forefront in terms of people being aware of it. Um, and that's why when you look at an ad, you click on something and then, oh my gosh, that thing you just looked at, those shoes you just looked at follow you all over the internet in every ad. That's why is the tracking that's happening on the back end.
Thank you so much for explaining that. And it makes so much sense, right? And I definitely, anytime cookies come up, I'm like, no, but then there'll be sites where if you don't press yes, then you can't
You
access
can't
the
access.
site.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really wild. And you kind of touched on this already, but how are the tech CEOs responding to this? Because as an artist, this has been a concern for the music industry with
Oh,
AI
totally.
and absolutely and coming when it came out and it was very concerning. It's still very concerning. And again, the lack of regulation, right? And I know that there have been some bills presented to protect musicians specifically, but I feel like it's not enough just because of the way the tech CEOs have responded specifically to that issue, where they're like, well, if we shut down AI taking, basically generating from the artist content that's already out there, then we would have no AI. So we can't shut it down, right? But for me as an artist, it's very insulting. And that's one way I know Texio has responded to it. But are any of them being held accountable at all in the United States, or it's just like you said, just a free for all basically right now?
No, it's really a free-for-all now. And some of these tech CEOs that are leading the AI companies, you have ones, of course, like Sam Altman, who that's an AI focused company, but then you have Mark Zuckerberg, who's the CEO of Meta, and Meta's putting all its chips in AI. Meta's still dealing with lawsuits for things with regard to its social media, and it's advancing with AI. And our lawmakers still haven't tackled the issue of social media. And what's amazing about this is that in this incredibly partisan environment that we're currently in, there's some rare bipartisan support for tech regulation. I mean, you see it in these hearings, lawmakers that are at odds on absolutely everything else are standing together when it comes to the issues of tech regulation, tech harms to children from the platforms. And so the fact that we're not seeing these bills pass really speaks to the broader influence of tech companies when it comes to lobbying in the United States. That's another reason, we see Europe moving forward. They don't have the same mechanisms for lobbying that we have here. And these tech companies are lobbying more than big oil, than big tobacco ever did, spending millions and millions of dollars on lobbying. And they're not just lobbying at the federal level. Over the past few years, states have said, okay, well, federal government's not going to do something. We're going to try to implement laws on kids' privacy, on, social media accountability and what have you. And these companies are also heavily lobbying at the state level to even stop the effort of states. In fact, they're so influential that a few months ago, you probably saw that there was a lot of concern about the administration was going to issue an executive order that would put a moratorium barring any states from implementing regulation on AI for 10 years. Now, that got huge pushback, including from Republicans who said, wait a minute, what about states' rights? And That's just goes to show that the fact that there was going to be an executive order issued by this from someone who, you know, we see if you look at the list of donors for the White House ballroom, a lot of them are AI CEOs. There's clear influence happening at the administration level that they're trying to leverage in a way to thwart even what federal, what the legislative branch is doing, what the state level is doing. And so it's something that Americans should be really concerned about. And this is all aside from the psychological privacy impacts of AI, the environmental and financial impacts of the data centers that support them. People who don't ever use AI may be really adversely affected by it, looking at their energy bill and not even know what's behind those increasing costs, the effects on the drought in their region. There are so many things tied up into it, and that's one of the reasons you see these tech companies wielding their influence as heavily as they are.
And it should concern all of us. And moving a little ahead to, what we just saw with Elon Musk's his Grok, even when people were undressing women and children. I want to read a quote from the TTP website that said, TTP identified 55 apps in the Google Play Store that can digitally remove the clothes from women and render them completely or partially naked or clad in a bikini or other minimal clothing. So when this first came to your attention, Katie, what was your immediate reaction and what were your first thoughts on everything that, just reading that like 55 apps because I see that and I'm just like my mouth drops. I shouldn't be shocked maybe, but I am.
Well, and what's important to remember, those are just the apps we found using our methodology and the handful of search terms we
Mm,
used. There are more
hmm.
out there. These are just the ones that surfaced with our methodology. And there were just as many in the Apple App Store, which the Apple App Store homepage says it's the most trusted app store. We've been doing research over the past couple years looking at apps in the app stores, showing that they should not be trusted. And when it came to the nudifying issue, I think the Grok stuff brought it to the forefront for something we already knew was happening because Grok was embedded in a public social media platform. So people who would never think about using one of these apps were like, "Oh my God, look at how many people are trying to make nude images of everybody." I think that really broke open the door in terms of the scale of it and that it was something people needed to pay attention to. But there are so many more apps than Grok that are dedicated explicitly to this. What was really concerning was some of the apps for, they would be advertised as clothes change or face swap or things like that were marketed for kids in Apple. They were marked for kids as young as 9. And that means that if these apps can be pushed to children who could either make an image of an adult nude and be exposed to something, some sort of sexual content that they shouldn't be, or more concerningly, that images of children could be rendered nude if children can upload images of themselves. These are things that are really concerning, not just privacy violations, but violations of the law. And I think that the potential for violating child sex abuse material laws is one of the reasons we saw the companies act to remove many of these apps. In the past, when we've done reports about really harmful apps or content on the platforms, on Apple and Google in particular, they don't really do a whole lot. So the fact that they moved to remove these is a indicator that they knew there was legal exposure concerning enough for them to act and remove these. But these companies both claim to have really stringent app review processes before the apps are live for public consumption. And this raises a lot of questions about what those processes actually look like. And it's another indicator that we cannot trust big tech companies to self-regulate from these kind of harms.
And we know that there have been bills passed that if you post someone's nude, and you do it for, quote unquote revenge porn, and that there have been bills passed that say that's against the law. So how is this any different than that when it comes to AI versus someone posting someone's nude and that being against the law?
Well, I mean, that's why you see new bills introduced like this Defiance Act that has bipartisan support, which is supposed to be about the creation of non-consensual nude imagery. So in the case of the revenge porn laws, those are images, intimate images that somebody themselves created. It's a different universe if the content was created by a platform. We're still grappling with how things like Section 230 would apply to that, where a technology company is creating it itself. Do they get that same immunity? Right now, that's not clear. And this is moving so quickly, we aren't seeing courts having the time to grapple with that kind of issue. And it will be interesting to see if the Defiance Act, which was just only very recently introduced, if it gets momentum moving forward. But we're going to continue to see these companies push back hard on this. I do know that in the UK, for instance, they are planning to implement a law that bans the ability of any app or website to create non-consensual nude imagery. You can do the clothes change stuff, but it can't create non-consensual nude imagery is under the law. And of course, they're limited to what can be enforced within the UK. But we have yet to see passage of something like that in the US. And part of it is the tech nexus here. And the revenge porn laws allow a person to be targeted for releasing that information. Here, a platform would need to be targeted, and we're talking about some of the most powerful platforms in the world. They have no intention of going quietly into that kind of regulation, and that's something that should concern all of us.
And it really does. And I think, it just shows uh who again is leading the charge on this, in terms of who is most responsible, and they aren't being held accountable. But I am glad to hear that Europe is leading the way, to pass these laws. And I hope, I'm sure you probably hope the same, Katie, is that this happens in the United States, but we are, these companies are being controlled by people who clearly care more about money than protecting, innocent people, unfortunately. And going off of that, I do want to read another quote from the TTP website, excuse me. Quote, the apps identified by TTP have been collectively downloaded more than 705 million times worldwide and generated $117 million in revenue, according to AppMagic, an app analytics firm. Because Google and Apple take a cut of that revenue, they are directly profiting from the activity of these apps. $117 million in revenue. So you've already kind of touched on this, what the company's roles are in this. And I wanted to know specifically with TTP, how are you working to hold them accountable?
Well, I mean, shining light on this, first of all, is one of the most important pieces of accountability. We simply ran searches, found these apps, and published about it. And the companies said, oh, whoops, those shouldn't be there, and removed a bunch of them. Just putting daylight on some of the things these companies are doing is forcing them to, take moves that they should have taken before these apps ever went live. And then there's the issue of raising, putting that daylight we're shining and showing those issues to lawmakers who are on the one hand being assured by lobbyists and members of these companies that they have these issues under control. And, what we're doing is showing no, they don't. And that these companies cannot be taken at face value. And I think, the revenue, the cut of the revenue the companies get from their share in the App Store is one piece of it. And what's critical to remember is so Apple in particular has been in lawsuits with Epic over the years about that because they charge a 30% fee for any in-app transaction that occurs. So if you're buying something for, a $100 a year subscription on a photo editing app, Apple's going to get $30 out of that, out of each of those transactions. And in the lawsuit with Epic, one of Apple's arguments for why it had to have these in-app purchase fees was because that's the money they use to help maintain the integrity and safety of the apps on the platform. So that raises a lot of questions about how that's actually being applied. And when we did these searches, not only did we find that the search for the word nudify in the App Store brought up a bunch of apps, which, if that's something that's not allowed in your App Store, why are you surfacing apps for that in the first place? But that one of the searches for that, Apple actually had an advertisement for an app that we discussed in the report that would render nude images. It was advertising that app. So it was also making money from the ads for an app that it later removed because they found it to violate their policies after we published about it. So there are a lot of layers here of the companies failing when it comes to safety, and not just safety, but privacy, digital privacy, not even your personal, self, but the digital privacy aspect, that should raise questions for everyone about how safe these platforms really are and the apps that they're hosting.
And looking over the TTP site, you did have quite a few apps listed, and one of the first ones you had listed is an app called Dreamface. And I just want our listeners to be aware that the app is rated suitable for ages 13 and up on Google Play, and even rated suitable for ages 9 and up in the Apple App Store. And there's literally direct access to nudity, and obviously making these generative AI and undressing women, etc. And since TTP is a nonpartisan organization, and both sides, everybody says they want to protect children. What is being done to protect children from this inappropriate content, if anything is being done at all?
Well, I mean, we've seen issues where some states are implementing the no social media for 16 and up, or the age verification laws. And those are important attempts, but I think it also, you're relying on the company to be doing the age verification and assuming that it's applying that correctly. You are also putting the responsibility on the user to self-regulate and not the company profiting from the harm that they're creating. So, of course, you see platforms really pushing that the app stores should be responsible for age verification, and the app store saying the platform should be responsible for the age verification. Nobody wants to take the responsibility to clean up the harms. And so while we've seen attempts, they all fall short of actually targeting the companies themselves for these harms. And that's where we really need to see movement. And as I mentioned, there have been many bills over the years introduced on a variety of issues with regard to tech, with regard to children. And they rarely, even if they have significant bipartisan support, these bills are not passing. The lobbying from these companies is significant. There was a hearing a few months ago, or maybe close to a year ago now, that with Senator Amy Klobuchar and Senator Josh Hawley about Meta, and specifically Meta and Facebook, how no matter what they try to raise, they lobby against everything. And Amy Klobuchar at one point even said, we've tried to raise issues about, banning and regulating the sale of fentanyl on these platforms, and Meta even lobbies against that. And it's to maintain the free for all that these companies have, because their business model relies on the lack of oversight for their profit.
And it is interesting what they deem as free speech versus what, they're allowing. And, we were talking earlier about just how realistic the AI chatbots and programs have become. And I myself have fallen into the trap of, oh my gosh, I thought this was real and it's not, So I guess what are one of the things you can recommend that people can do to spot fake AI content? And going off of that, for our listeners, if they ever, if this ever happens to them, are victims of this AI, this generative AI, legally allowed to sue if their pictures are used in AI deepfakes or undressing? And if so, what would that process look like?
So for the first piece, I think looking at everything with an eye of skepticism that you see online, verifying something is real by looking at traditional media sources is probably the best way now. There are some AI generators like Gemini that'll put a watermark. Those can easily be cropped out. As you mentioned, the AI is in many cases indistinguishable from a real photo. Some of the AI chatbots are getting really creepy and even coughing and sneezing like regular people. This is all, they're becoming increasingly human-like in the way that they operate. And so anything, whether it's a voice cloning thing, a video, a photo, always looking to see if there is an original source for that that's not just some account posting it on social media. Because unfortunately, that is where a lot of this stuff is proliferating where people can't tell the difference. And that goes for ads as well. We see tons of deep fakes in bought and paid for ads on Meta for scams. We've published about this before as well. Deep fakes of politicians pushing scams on Meta platforms, and so don't trust the ads either. Is my point. Always looking for original sources or legacy media, but being skeptical about anything until you see it posted by a legitimate reporter, a legitimate media organization. When it comes to accountability, I think that there are several things. On the one hand, with regard to lawsuits, what we're seeing with most lawsuits is a lot of companies end up getting these cases dismissed before they ever see a courtroom. Something that's not related to AI, but is in the headlines right now, is this big case about Meta and YouTube and social media addiction for kids. Part of the reason that's getting a lot of attention is because it's actually happening in court. Meta and YouTube did not get that case dismissed. And that's rare when it comes to lawsuits against these companies. So there's a lot of eyes on that because it could really be a major pendulum swing for accountabilities on these companies at the civil level. One of the things if this does happen to you, when it comes to the non-consensual nude images, a lot of people, there's shame associated, even if you've not done anything wrong. And it's critical to report that this has happened to authorities and create that record. Now, you can do that to your local police. I would also and heavily recommend reporting to the FBI's cybercrime unit, which you can report content to. And I say that because even if you don't see action on your specific case, when lawmakers are considering passing some of these bills, they'll rely on the statistics that come from law enforcement, that come from government authorities about the scale of something based on reporting. And the more people that report that this is happening, especially to the FBI's cybercrime unit, which tracks data on a variety of things that are reported to them, then it's easier for lawmakers to get an understanding of the scale and impact of this that they can take into their decision making. But more than anything, I think the American public, and I want to be clear, these apps do not just advertise removing clothing from women. Several of them also have like the removing shirts from men as one of the thumbnail photos. So women and men and boys and girls are all at equal risk when it comes to the non-consensual nude images. But making sure people make noise to their lawmakers about this, that this is unacceptable, and that they want to see action. And not just the lawmaker who's in your party, and not just the one who is at the federal level, also your state level lawmakers. Because the more they hear from the public that put them there, that this is something that is important to regulate, the more likely they are to address this, especially with the midterm elections coming up.
I'm so grateful we're having this conversation and for the clarity you're giving me, and I'm sure you're giving our listeners. And this is something that has worried me myself, and I've talked about it from an artist perspective, but also just as a human being. It just is something that is concerning and something, as you said, we should all be paying attention to. Um, so with that being said, overall, do you have hope for future generations that this issue will have a resolution? And in an ideal world, what would that look for you in TTP in this country, the United States of America?
You know, these days, with the way things are going globally, it's hard to predict what the future of regulation would look like. It's hard to predict if there's an administration change, if that will change. But what I do have hope for is that we now have an entire generation of young people whose lives are spent on social media. Facebook didn't exist until I was in college. And so these kids now that are growing up fully immersed in this, they are ahead of all of us. They understand the harms. They live with those anxieties every single day. They live with the impact of these platforms. They live with the fact that a lot of what they see online may not be true. And kids are becoming aware of it. I think that that new generation that's going to be more digitally literate and aware than the rest of us, that's where the real hope lies in terms of they're the ones that are going to suffer the most from the harms of these platforms, whether it's the non-consensual nude images, whether it's online bullying or addiction issues to social media. And as they come into their own and mature and grow and end up, becoming our lawmakers and policymakers, they're the ones that are really going to move the bar. And we can try to pave the path for them, but I think that the the generations that are growing up living these harms every single day are the ones who are really going to make the change moving forward.
I think that's so beautifully said, and I have hope for this future generations. And you always hope every generation is smarter than the next because they have more information at their disposal. So I just think having this information in general, I mean, it's definitely given me a lot of clarity. And going on to one of my final questions before I hand it back to Zachary. I want to know how our listeners can support the work you are doing and how the work that TTP is doing.
Well, you can go to our website. We are a nonprofit. We're always looking for support, but I think amplifying any of this to the broader population, as I mentioned, we do a lot of great reports that are meant for the public to digest. We're not using heavy tech jargon. But people need to be able to read those and actually understand where the harms are. Some of the things I'm in these online communities every day, and I'm still shocked by the things that I see. But I think awareness is really the most important thing, and being aware of not just the platforms, but also the influence behind them. We even have a database on our website that if you are watching a congressional hearing and there's 5 organizations listed as third-party independent groups, you can search our database and see if those groups are actually getting funding from tech or not. I think that just having a better understanding of the role of these companies beyond just the app you're using day to day is really important in our own awareness of these issues, holding our lawmakers accountable, and making clear that it's unacceptable for this Wild West to keep going. As a society in both the United States and globally, we can no longer accept this as the status quo.
Katie, thank you so much for being here. Was there anything else you'd like to add to share with our listeners? And again, thank you for this clarity, and I've learned a lot today.
Yeah, we will be continuing to keep an eye on this issue. So keep an eye on our website as we check in on these companies and see, did they really fix the problem that they claim they did? Spoiler, they usually don't. But we'll continue to keep an eye on this and try to hold them accountable, even if the lawmakers don't.
looking at your database and the big tech funding database, this is wild, first of all. So AARP, Google. um, Honestly, I'm not surprised, that it doesn't surprise me one bit, but there's 158 pages
Hmm.
on, looking at this website and just going through this, ad council,
And
Google.
this is just what the companies themselves
Wild.
disclose they fund. There's other
Mhm.
stuff they fund that they don't self-disclose. This is just their own disclosures, which are buried in a PDF, buried at five
Mhm.
pages deep somewhere on their website. But we've found them all and
Which
brought
is
them to the surface.
intentional.
We also found there's a bill that passed back in 2019 that was signed into law during the first Trump administration called FOSTA
Mhm.
SESTA. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that. But basically, it was the Backpage.com case. And the whole idea was that tech companies were facilitating sex trafficking and trafficking of minors.
Mhm.
And this bill was to put a crack in the Section 230 liabilities that companies would be held liable if they were knowingly facilitating sex trafficking. If you look at some of the end dates of or the last years that the certain organizations related to kids or sex trafficking related organizations were funded, after that they were only funded while the companies were lobbying against that bill. Once the bill got signed into law, they didn't get funded again by big tech. And it's a good example of how big tech tries to use small organizations that are reliant and need funding as a mouthpiece when it serves their lobbying interests.
Good God. I'm just sitting, I'm sorry, I'm just sitting here reading some of these and I'm like, oh my Lord.
Yeah, I looked over it to it's today and it was like, wow, this is horrific, but also not surprising, right? Unfortunately,
Mhm.
just with the response that has been in general that we've seen with how women and children and the most vulnerable communities have been treated, right?
Exactly. I mean, we even found that last year, after the administration had released a list of certain phrases, DEI, that they claimed were DEI related
Mhm.
phrases that would not be getting different types of funding. Google removed 55 or ceased to fund 55 groups that it had previously funded, or at least it wasn't listing that it was funding them, that had those DEI related phrases. We did a report about that last year, but it just goes to show how these companies kind of change their activity and what they're standing for publicly based on who's in power.
Wherever the
Mhm.
money is, right?
Exactly.
And I see that even some elected officials have quoted, TTP in some of their memorandums and some of their statements. I think this is very interesting. I'm looking at one that went out from Senator Blumenthal's office to the FTC chairman. And,
Yeah.
it's so damning just to see how these big tech companies have literally failed generations. And, it'll continue failing generations unless there's some type of transparency, which, no pun intended, but, the tech transparency.
Yeah.
I think it's just incredible just to kind of see, what's really happening.
Yeah. And what
And
you'll notice with those letters, a lot of them are bipartisan.
mhm,
Many of them are signed by lawmakers of both parties and
mhm,
still getting ignored by the companies in the terms of the way they're operating, which should worry Congress about, the weight that they carry without meaningful regulation. These companies are ultimately ignoring the concerns that they're raising.
mhm, exactly. But yeah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Gwen, thank you so much for also being here as well. And, you know,
Abs-
I think, we can continue to have these conversations because there's going to be a lot that's going to continue happening and AI is not going away. We know that. If anything, it's going to continue ramping up. And we see that because they have no accountability, like literally whatsoever. Um, Are you familiar? And this will be like my last thing. So there was something that came out a couple months ago, and it was about Google AI people can go into Google AI and they can create videos. And there was a thing, I think it was a UK professor that might have cracked this or something. My memory is kind of foggy. Full disclosure to anybody who's listening, I've been under upper respiratory infection for the last few weeks, and my brain is foggy. Um, but there was something that came out not too long ago, and I think it was like later last year, that people were going into Google AI and creating like YouTube videos and uploading them of like how to murder women and how to do this and how to do that. That's deeply alarming. Like even thinking about this runs through people's minds, right? And then we think about like serial killers like Ted Bundy. When we think of serial killer, it's just so bizarre about what has happened with AI. You mentioned 1996. That was a great year. Not just because I was born, but there was a lot that happened around like accountability at that point. But since then, it's gotten so incredibly rough and it's off its rocker. But do you remember what I'm talking about, or kind of like, were you
Yeah,
aware of that?
and there are, some tech companies are trying to kind of harm test, like
Hmm.
Anthropic claims that they do this to try to see what kind of things the AI will generate, the information wise that they have to put a blockage on or stop. But we know that even terrorist groups are now using AI to generate recruitment videos.
Hmm.
Um, and part of the reason AI does a good job of that is because the social media platforms that all the previous recruitment videos are on that never got moderated out are just being scraped to help inform the AI. So you see how the failure of regulation just compounds itself moving forward. It's these types of harms are not going to change. There's a lot of AI slop on all of the platforms now, and there's a lot of slop that's harmful. Unfortunately, people don't need the dark web to find these things. This is just technology now.
It's almost inevitable that, it's going to affect somebody's child in Congress, etc., where they will actually care. But even though it is alarming that there have been bills presented that have not been taken up because of who's in power. But after hearing this, talking to you, Katie, like this whole conversation, it just feels like something will have to be done, don't you think?
I think the people are waking up, the American population is waking up to the harm of these platforms. They're no longer, um, mystified by technology, and now they're experiencing the harms. They're seeing the harms of scams to their parents. They're seeing the harms of, AI to their kids, and people are waking up and they want accountability. People are starting to demand that from lawmakers. And even now, when you see these younger people stepping into the political arena, one of the things that they commonly will talk about is the importance of regulating tech harms to kids. They see it every day with their own children. And I think that the more people wake up and demand accountability from their lawmakers, the harder it will be for these companies to wield their influence.
Hmm. Exactly. When you say a key word of accountability, we just got to kind of sit back and think about what does accountability really look like? Thinking about that, and we know that this Department of Justice is not going to do a damn thing about accountability, but that's a whole different
That,
conversation because I
that's a
watched
different
the
podcast episode.
yes, because I watched the Pam Bondi testimony before the Judiciary Committee earlier this week, and it was very damning. But um, again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. We greatly appreciate your time and your efforts, and if there's anything that we can do to continue uplifting, please let us know. And um, just keep doing this damn thing because somebody's got to do it, right? Because if we don't do it, it ain't gonna get done, right? And I think
Exactly.
Gwen said it best earlier. Politicians are starting to wake up because now they're starting to be impacted by this. Like they've turned a blind eye, and now that they're actually being affected by it, now you know what I mean. And oftentimes, they say the people who have the best solutions are closest to the problem, and that's kind of leading directly into this. But again, thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and Um, Please take care of yourself.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me and for continuing to put a focus on issues like this. It's really important.
Thank you so
Absolutely.
much, Katie. It's been such a pleasure to talk to you today, and we're just very honored you're here. Thank you.